I'm very pleased to be joined by Nuvar Hovsepian, who's the author of the biography Edward Said, The Politics of an Oppositional Intellectual. I've had the good fortune to get to know Nubar a little bit over the last couple of years and have learned a tremendous amount from him and from his book about Edward Said, someone I never had the good fortune to know, but someone who Nubar knew extremely well. I guess, Nubar, just to start in a very basic place, for people who are not so familiar with Said, can you sketch out his biography?
Sure. But first, may I just compliment you on the moral courage that is so thoroughly expressed in your book, Being Jewish After the Destruction of Gaza. I'm moved by that, and I think it's a perfect example of moral clarity.
Thank you.
Sure. And I read it, and I gifted my book to my daughter who lives in Jersey.
Tell her I appreciate it.
Sure. Now, Edward Said, in sum, he is, I think in many ways we can say he was born with a silver spoon and gold spoon in his mouth, right? The son of a privileged Palestinian who was from Jerusalem. His mother is from Nazareth. He was a precocious child. He was smart. He grew up in time of the anti-colonial struggles in Egypt. He was destined to follow his father's footsteps, but luckily he did not for us, because he discovered a world of fiction through which he expanded his understanding of the world in the real world by writing about criticism and all that. So
his father was in business, right?
His father was a businessman, yes. His mother was a rather interesting figure as well. He comes from a Protestant background. So he always said, I'm part of a minority, because Protestants are a small minority of the Christian community in Palestine, the bulk being divided between Orthodox and Catholic. And his presence, if you will, is one that emerges over time. First, as a brilliant scholar, young scholar everybody touts as important at Columbia University and what have you. But then he later becomes a public persona in a real sense, the oppositional intellectual, the quintessential oppositional intellectual over time. And it's all about the question of Palestine that makes him to think in terms of liberation, of ideas that are necessary to inform how you construct fields of coexistence between peoples, which is central to his understanding. So in sum, he is one who has produced an important narrative on Palestine, an oppositional narrative, and one that provided an antithesis to the Israeli narrative that excludes Palestinians from his purview.
And what was the political milieu in Said's house growing up? Was it a kind of Palestinian nationalist environment? How was he shaped in his views about being Palestinian from his childhood?
I mean, basically, he saw himself and his family as a Palestinian family because of war. In 1948 was displaced to Amman and then to other places. His father had a business in Cairo. So he always saw himself as a Palestinian, but a privileged one. He always understood that he was privileged because that's important to acknowledge, right? As opposed to just being a dweller of the camp or a poor person. He was not.
Yes.
That. So, yes, he grew up Palestinian in a Palestinian home. His relatives were part of the Palestinian story, whether they lived in exile or in Palestine or abroad. His relatives were part of the liberation movement. Kamal Nasser, a friend who was a poet in the early days of the PLO in Beirut. So, he was part of the story, but he was also not as fully formed by the story until after 1967.
And how does he end up in the United States?
To come to study. He literally came to study at Princeton.
But he goes to boarding school first, right?
He went to a boarding school because he was kicked out of the school he was in, Victoria College in Egypt, because of his anti-colonial activities during the king's reign, King Farouk. So he ends up going to finish his school in Connecticut, I think it was. And then he goes to Princeton, and then to Harvard, and then to Columbia, right?
Mhm.
So it's a perfectly elite education and elite institutions that he was part of.
And at first, his writing is not about Palestinians in Palestine, right? I mean, he
Yeah,
makes his name as a literary critic, right? I mean, he's writing
right,
about novels.
right.
So talk about his early work, intellectual work, and then what leads him to become publicly writing about this question of the Palestinian experience and of Zionism.
Well, remember, one of his earliest work is a dissertation that becomes a book on Conrad.
Mm.
And Conrad is an important figure for Said because Conrad is the quintessential colonialist, anti-colonialist,
Mm.
right? He was part of the colonial venture, but he also pointed out the challenges to the human life,
Mm.
to people who will be subjected to it. Then he moves on with a book called Beginnings, but in Beginnings, he's already suggesting some element of Palestine in his thinking. It's there, it's never muted, but it's never fully pronounced until after those two works. So in the beginning, he is really interested in literature, in comparative literature, and in incorporating ideas that were not coming from the continent, but from overseas. So he brings in and popularizes ideas raised by Foucault and others. And he also departs from Foucault later on, right? Because he found Foucault's approach to be too limiting, and he pays deference to power as if it's unchangeable, whereas he thinks power has to be resisted, right? So those are his earlier works. And then he starts gravitating on, with Beginnings, thinking about Orientalism, which is probably his first major work that tries to understand himself. It is, after all, as he puts it, in a Gramscian sense, he is producing a narrative, a self-understanding that is negated by the colonial and imperial experiences. He's creating a register of understanding by deconstructing imperialism and by also identifying the resistance to imperialism, which is suggested but not fully developed until his next work, which is Culture and Imperialism. In Culture and Imperialism, this is where he gives voice. He identifies with the liberation ideas, with liberation movements. This is where he adopts people like Cabral, and his friend Iqbal Ahmad is highly influential in this understanding of that history, the colonial history and the anti-colonial struggles, whether they were in Ireland or in India or in Latin America. He looks at that, and this provides him with an understanding of resistance that must be marshaled to pursue justice and truth.
And can you talk a little bit about how Said dealt with, I think, an issue that, more recently many people think about, which is, on the one hand, he seems to have a deep, deep understanding and affection for a lot of Western cultural production, right? I mean, literature. I mean, he's steeped in the English novel.
Yeah.
He speaks in French theory and obviously in music, and yet he's also a critic of it as reflecting and being interconnected with imperial racist ideas. So can you talk about how he navigates this, maybe I could say it too crudely, kind of love-hate relationship with this Western cultural legacy?
Well, it is, in some ways, we can put it as a love-hate relationship. It is also one that his music is very important here. I mean, his choices of music are more classical than they would be, say, modern Arabic, right? Or any other type. I don't think he understood, say, blues and jazz as well as he probably should. That's what his brother in arms, Cornel West, tried to impart to him, and others who knew that. But Said's view is that in studying the West and being part of it, you're also its greatest critic. You're also holding the mirror up to it and say, this is what you mean. It's not only your liberal ideas, also colonialism and racism and subjugation, etc. So this is what he complicates the West, right? So and the West could be Trump, and it could be Martin Luther King and Malcolm X, right? So he chooses Malcolm X and Martin Luther King and Baldwin over the right-wing interpretation of Trump et al.
This has been a free preview of my weekly conversation. If you'd like to hear the rest and support my work, please consider subscribing at peterbeinart.substack.com.